So, Eightfold Path. So these 8 elements of the Eightfold Path fall into 3 categories: prajna, shila, samadhi. So prajna, wisdom, right, which includes right view, right intention. Shila is the morality, ethics, precept piece, right? So right speech, right action, right livelihood, which is really about what are we doing with this body. Samadhi is concentration, so that's right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. So you will notice that the Eightfold Path uses this word right in front of each of these elements. This is not right as opposed to wrong. This is not you do this way, it's right, you do anything else, it's wrong, and you're condemned to suffer in one of the many, many, many layers of hell realms forever and ever, right? Not that kind of right. This is in the sense of being in alignment with the way the universe actually works. Are we creating dissonance? Are we creating suffering? Are we working against ourselves and other beings, right? That's how we can view that sort of right. If we're doing things under this right, we're not creating additional karma and suffering and disturbance for ourselves and others. In early Buddhism, it might be we're not setting up the conditions where we're going to be reborn in this world to keep on, reborn in samsara to keep on suffering, right? Okay, so these 3 groups and these 8 elements, I think, help us to create a balanced life, a sustainable kind of balanced life. Trying to work on any one of these without working on the other ones doesn't work so well. That's not to say we can't decide, for the next month in my practice, I'm really going to focus on, right speech. We can do that. But to isolate 1 or 2, or even a group of the, one of the categories and say, the rest of them don't matter, doesn't work very well for the same reasons that we have 16 precepts and we need to do 16 and not 1 or 2, right? These things are really, really interconnected. If you're doing, mindfulness, for instance, without zazen, without precepts, it's frustrating, it's not sustainable, it won't last, you won't feel like you have a balance, right? So on the back of your handout, you will notice there is a dharma wheel. I've given you the picture of the dharma wheel with the Eightfold Path. I'm sorry, that's a little bit grainy. Clearly, I grabbed it and stuck it on the page for you. What's important about this is this thing is a wheel. It's not a line. So the wheel spins both directions. Sometimes we hear about this image, right, in Buddhism of the Dharma wheel, turning the Dharma wheel. Turning the Dharma wheel can mean teaching, but it can also just mean practicing, right? So the activity of practice, this wheel is going forth and back. And in this diagram, we can see they're also kind of linked across the wheel. Now, I'm not saying that right effort is directly linked to right awareness, and that's the only link. Don't take that literally. But the point of this thing is these things arise together for us. It's not that we work on one and then we work on the next and then we work on the next and then we pass that test and we go on to, right? These things are arising, functioning, moving together all the time. So this thing is a wheel. It's not a set of steps. It's not a linear path. Okay? So, briefly looking at each of these, and again, it will be brief, given the time we have. Right view. Right view is really about seeing and understanding these 4 noble truths. It's about really seeing and understanding that this Eightfold Path is a better means to a wholesome life than getting caught up in our karma and our delusion and clinging and grasping. And right, we can see very clearly that this is a wholesome way to go. This is a wholesome path. So it might sound like this is an intellectual exercise. It is not. Right view sounds like, oh, that's my thinking, that's my intellect. It's not. The way we get to grips with this thing is to get on the cushion, like we just did for half an hour, right? Settling down in zazen, seeing through the fabrications, the cravings, the grasping, getting that even though we're all baby bodhisattvas on this path, right? No matter how long we've been practicing, we're going to continue to fall off the path. We'll talk about vow and repentance at some point, right? We're going to have an aspiration to walk this Eightfold Path. We're going to fall off, and nonetheless, this is a good thing. To aspire to live in Buddha's way is a healthy, wholesome thing. Not just because we're sort of taking that because somebody says so, but we actually clearly see this is the way we need to be working. So it's not about accepting dogma. It's not about doing or believing, what a teacher says or even what the Buddha says, right? It's about cultivating our own experiences of clarity. How do we get to clarity? How do we get to wisdom? This is what keeps aspiration strong so we don't give up, right? We see a little bit. We understand something. It's like, oh, yeah. There's a reason to like keep going with this, right? Okay, right intention, sometimes translated right thought, right resolve, right aspiration, right? So the main idea is thought leads to speech and action. So it's important to pay attention to thought and cultivate wholesome thought, because if we don't, or even if we do, the next thing we're going to do is say something, and the next thing we're going to do is take some action with this body. So if thoughts go off the rails, the rest of that sequence goes off the rails. So it's really important to pay attention to intention, thought, resolve, right? It's easy to just sort of let habituated thinking rise up and drag us around. Maybe we don't notice we're in the grips of habituated thinking. We just sort of react to things without any real intention. This is why intention is important. I intend to live like a bodhisattva. I intend to not get hijacked by my stuff. I'm still going to get hijacked by my stuff because I'm in this karmic form. But my intention is not to just ride that train out of town. My intention is to go, oh, wait a minute. Is this really the wholesome thing to do, say, think, right? So if we don't do that, then we deal with the consequences. We deal with the suffering to ourselves or to other beings, right? So intention is important. So the good news, again, is that we have a choice. We don't need to just mindlessly react to our stuff or to circumstances without setting any particular intention. We don't have to feel blindsided by the resulting suffering or conflict, or we don't need to feel powerless to escape from something. We can set some intention. So in Zazen, we can begin to notice that habituated thinking. Usually, we're not paying much attention to what's arising, right? We're simply in the world responding to things moment by moment by moment. We just sort of take our thoughts to be a complete, accurate representation of the way the world actually is. Well, then we can start to see, oh, wait a minute. What I thought was true isn't necessarily the whole story. It might not be that my thinking is wrong. It just might be incomplete, right? So we really can start to see, oh, my thinking is my story, right? It's not necessarily an accurate map of the world. We get to stop and realize my thoughts are my creations, or as Uchiyama Roshi says, fabrication. It's all fabrication. So not the whole story. Okay, that's right intention. Right speech, really a critical part of our practice. Oh my goodness. There's almost no place we don't have an opportunity to deal with right speech. It's really connected to everything else we do. This is not just about saying nice things to each other or not saying uncomfortable things to each other. Right speech is really complicated because we'd like to think, oh, it's just nicey nice, and that's not what's going on. Sometimes we need to have a hard conversation, and that can be right speech. So, right speech is about refraining from the four evils, right? Lying, idle or frivolous speech, harsh or abusive speech, and divisive speech, which is like backbiting and malicious gossip and things that are designed to drive a wedge between people, right? So again, lying, idle or frivolous speech, harsh or abusive speech, or divisive speech. Backbiting, gossip, that sort of thing. These are the four evils, right? Now, if you've been around Sanshin at all, you've heard me talk about this more than once. If you look at my 108 Gates talk series, we come back to right speech quite a bit, and those four evils. So again, unwholesome thought leads to unwholesome speech, leads to unwholesome action. So in order to really watch right speech, we have to start by watching right thinking, right thought. So conflict can escalate very quickly, as we know, from I have an unwholesome thought to I say something unkind or inappropriate or something, and the next thing we know there's physical violence, and the next thing we know there's physical violence amongst more than one human being, and we just watch this thing, right, escalate and go off the rails. So maybe I tell a lie, maybe it's not even a big lie, and then I have to tell more lies to cover up the first one, right? I have to do things to manage that situation, and it just grows like Topsy and gets out of control. So the whole thing starts to spiral, right? Suffering leads to more creation of karma for ourselves and for other beings. And we know, I don't need to provide you any examples of those things, right? We see that happen all the time. So that's right speech. Right action. Right action arises from this right view, right intention. Again, thought, speech, action. In order to carry out right action, we need to see reality as it actually is, sometimes called awakening, sometimes called enlightenment, although that's not a great word. right? We need to have wisdom to really see how reality works. So we understand suffering, we understand interdependence, we understand the true nature of self, how these things are all related. When we really understand how all of that works, then right action arises naturally, right? There's nothing we have to learn, there's no decision we have to make. As bodhisattvas, we move through the world taking right action because we see how to be in alignment with the dharma, right? With the reality of how this universe is working. So when that's what's going on, we're not living in our own idea of the world, or as Soto-san was talking about on Sunday, right? The difference between living by vow and living by karma, right? If we live by vow, we're being pulled by our aspiration as bodhisattvas. If we're living by karma, we're being driven by greed, anger, and ignorance. And then the action that results from that is as skillful or not as those things are. So it's important that we really get that. So we're not living in a fantasy. We're not living in our world of fabrications and then responding to fabrications as opposed to responding to reality, how things are actually working. So if we don't see the reality of the world, we don't know what to do, right? We don't know how to act. We're clouded by our stuff. We've probably all had some experience of that where we take some action based on what we understand at the time, and later on we get some new piece of information and we go, oh, had I known that, had I seen that that was what was really going on, I would have done something else, right? I would have been more effective. So we do things based on our delusion. Sometimes we do things based on how we wish things were. Anyone ever done that? I don't want to look at this thing because that's not comfortable, that's not what I want, so I'm going to act based on what I wish was happening. And if we were outside looking at ourselves, we would go, what are we doing? Or we've seen other people do that, right? What are you doing? It's called denial, right? We don't want to operate from a place of denial. So we need to make an effort to sit, to see through delusion, to become very, very familiar with our own selves, with our own functioning, how our minds work, how we're creating self, how we're creating fabrication on what we think, how we think the world is. We need to sit to do that. So what we do matters. We might think we're little individual people in a little world doing our little things, you know, and that what we do doesn't matter. Well, there is nothing outside the Buddha way or outside this one unified reality. And if that's true, then what I do affects others, and what others do affects me, and there's no way around that, right? If non-separation is the way things are, there is no way that what we're doing isn't affecting somebody else, some other being, some unfolding karma somewhere, right? What a responsibility. So when we get to precepts and morality, I mean, we come back to that, right? It's like everything we do has an effect. So we don't get to slack off as bodhisattvas. Now, we shouldn't be paralyzed by that. It's possible to be paralyzed by that. Let's not, let's not do that. Okay, so consequences are bigger than ourselves. We need to think about right action. Right livelihood. So there are 5 types of wrong livelihood for lay people in the early teachings. And I would say we're still working with these today. Those 5 wrong livelihoods: dealing in weapons, dealing in human beings, dealing in meat, intoxicants, or poison. Weapons, human beings, meat, intoxicants, and poison. Now, is that open to interpretation? You better believe it. Again, when we get to precepts, these are big, big conversations. So that's for lay people. For monks, there's also wrong livelihood. We're not supposed to tell fortunes. We're not supposed to interpret dreams. We're not supposed to cast spells and ask you for your money. Right? If you pay me a certain amount, I will cast a spell and everything will be okay for you. You can't ask me for that. I do read tarot from time to time, but only for me. So I won't do it for you and you can't pay me for it. Okay, so, they're just saying we need to live in the world of reality. Okay, so right livelihood, we understand work as a manifestation of Buddha nature, just like Zazen is a manifestation of Buddha nature. So when we go to work in the morning or at night, how is that different from doing Zazen? It might feel very, very different. We're not sitting quietly in a zendo somewhere. So we might think, well, I go and do Zazen and then I go to work. I would challenge you and say, what's the difference between these things, right? It's all a manifestation of Buddha nature. There is no separation really between spiritual life, practice, and work. So how we carry our practice into the world, and also how we take that opportunity to investigate interconnectedness, to really appreciate, become aware of that, see how it functions, right, is a really interesting practice. So we frequently say here at Sanshin, we try to make the distinction, say, people will think that when we have a work day, that's volunteer work. Work practice is not volunteer work. Work practice is practice. So it's not a case of I'm coming to the temple because I'm going to give something because I'm being magnanimous and it makes me feel good, and then I'm going to go home and do something else. Or that a work day is somehow not a practice day. Work and practice are not separate, right? So, of course, right livelihood, not isolated from the rest of the Eightfold Path. We need right view, for instance, to discern what is or is not right livelihood. And I would say any activity, any practice activity in this Eightfold Path where we're dealing with human beings, we have to think about right livelihood, because it's not just the work we're doing in the office, it's what are we doing at home, what are we doing with our families, what are we doing in our neighborhoods, right? We can really extend this to say right action in a very particular way. Okay, so right livelihood, not separate from anything else. It's a chance to also practice right speech, to also practice right action, have right intention, right? It's a manifestation of something. And we spend a lot of time at work, so what a huge dharmic gate. Even if we don't have time to be sitting sesshin, we can bring our practice to work. Nobody has to know we're doing it. We don't have to get up in a box and try to convert people. I used to take when I worked for the government for 16 years, I took my practice to work. Not in an overt way, right? But it was there. Okay, right effort. Right effort is made up of something we sometimes call the four exertions, or the four endeavors, depending on your translation. And these are very familiar. I'm sure you've heard them before, but this is where they kind of fit in, which is what makes this useful to me. So, keeping unwholesome states from arising. Unwholesome states. Abandoning unwholesome states that have already arisen. Cultivating the arising of wholesome states, and perpetuating wholesome states that have arisen. So you see the pattern here, right? We want to keep the unwholesomeness from arising. If it does, we're going to let go of it. Instead, we're going to cultivate wholesomeness, and when that wholesomeness is here, we're going to try to keep it going, right? It's a simple pattern. Four exertions or four endeavors. So unwholesomeness here refers to something that's caught up in the three poisons of greed, anger, and ignorance. So wholesomeness, greed, anger, and ignorance. Three poisons, greed, anger, and ignorance. At some point, I'm sure we're going to look at the wheel of life, and then we'll see where they are right in the very hub of this thing, right? Not today, a future week. So greed, anger, and ignorance are the three poisons. This is the root of all of our delusion. And again, these things are interconnected. So if that's unwholesomeness, then wholesomeness, if we flip those around, wholesomeness is generosity, loving kindness, and wisdom. So we can say, we just flip it over and go, oh, we're headed away from this unwholesomeness and toward this wholesomeness. When we look at precepts, not here because we don't have time, but in the precepts retreat, we'll see there's a sort of prohibitory list, and then there's another list that says, here's what we do instead. We can always look at these things from both sides. So how do we do these four exertions? How do we keep unwholesomeness from arising? Well, we might be aware of what we could call temptation, right? There's plenty of temptation. Let's avoid situations where we're likely to fall into bad habits or fall into mistakes or get pulled off track by, other people or whatever that might be for us. When we see those things starting, we can do something else. When we see unwholesomeness arising, let's be aware. And again, this is where being aware of how the suffering arises and how our thought patterns work and our habituated thinking is important. This is one reason sitting is important, right? We need to see this stuff starting to arise and choose to do something else, right intention. Yep. I'm being tempted by that chocolate cake and I'm trying to lose weight. Nope, choose the apple, And that's a simple example. There are lots of them. Okay, second one, abandoning unwholesome states that have arisen, right? So again, we need to see what's happening, we need to see where things are going, and we need to recognize the consequences, because it's pretty easy to go, it'll be okay. That bad outcome, that'll never happen. Really? Has it happened every time to you before? Well, then it's probably going to happen again, right? Foolish, what is it that they say is doing the same thing and expecting a different result?
Insanity.
Insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result? Okay, so we can see what's happening. We can cultivate that opposite wholesome quality. If I'm feeling like stingy, miserly, and I see that's going on, somebody needs something from me, and I'm clinging to whatever that is, can I instead cultivate generosity? Can we do the opposite thing? So this is Zazen mind, right? Opening the hand, letting thoughts come and go, not getting stuck, right? Okay. So cultivating and perpetuating wholesome states, well, let's put ourselves in wholesome circumstances, which means containers where we can keep the precepts. It means surrounding ourselves with good friends. That can be Sangha, but that can be, grandma. That can be anybody who's a good influence, right? A wholesome influence on us. Let's do some healthy activity. Yes, that's Zazen. It might be walking. It might be art. It might be whatever feels wholesome, healthy. Let's do the wholesome thing as opposed to the thing that's going to keep us trapped in greed, anger, ignorance, delusion, suffering, clinging, right? So, right effort gives us the energy to practice. It's important that that energy is directed toward wholesomeness. And we do that with these elements of the Eightfold Path. So it's, again, not just one. We need the support of all of them. I'm artificially pulling them apart, but, we can't actually do that. Otherwise, if we're not putting our energy into wholesomeness, we're putting it into perpetuating delusion and suffering. So this is one of the reasons, for instance, that morality is important. It's not just about we're going to get really, really focused. We're going to sit a lot of Zazen. We're going to get really, really focused. Well, we can get really, really focused on how am I going to be the world's best assassin. And that's not practice, right? Without the ethical piece, for instance, how do we use the energy, right? So right energy, we need to be focusing on something which is wholesome and helpful. Because, again, we have to do our own practice. No one can do it for us. So we can have teachers, we can have Dharma friends, we can have Sangha. No one can do our practice for us. There's no liberation outside of our own activity. There's no practice without us doing practice. Practice isn't something sitting out here. Practice is what are we doing with this body and mind, right? So we rise and fall based on our own diligence. And again, non-reliance is one of the ways we talk about that here, right? We can only rely on our own bodhicitta. Right mindfulness. How are we doing? Okay. Right mindfulness. Well, there's lots and lots of talk about mindfulness. Probably everybody here has an idea what you think mindfulness is. In this tradition, mindfulness is simply about remembering to practice, remembering what Buddha taught. So, kind of remembering what we're doing and why. Why are we taking on this crazy practice, right? What are we here to do? And then, I kind of think there's the piece there about intention, right? Like, I'm on this path. Like, what's my intention? How do I intend to live? And then I remember that. Again, vow and repentance is important. So, yes, there are exercises out there where, you eat a raisin or you eat an orange section or a potato chip and you focus on all the sensations that arise from that. That's lovely. That is not what mindfulness means here. It simply means remember to practice, right? So memory keeps coming up in this practice tradition. And that could be a whole other interesting, like someday I'll give a Dharma talk about that because memory is really interesting. Chanting, when we do chanting in the morning or when we put on a raksu or in front of a meal, right? Chanting is about remembering teachings. We're verbalizing teachings because we're getting them in the body. We're remembering them. I don't know if you've had this experience, but sometimes when we've been practicing for a while and we've been doing the same chant enough that we're no longer having to read it, it's just coming out, our experience of that content shifts dramatically because we're not having to go through the mechanics of I'm reading and stumbling over the words, and right? Somehow it's coming out of my mouth and I'm like, oh. When I started practicing, I was in a place where at the end of the day during Sesshin, every night we would chant for Kanza Zengi. It was the last thing we did before we left the Zendo for the night. And you do it enough, one day I realized I didn't need to read it. And so I was chanting along. And the first about 3 lines, I went, oh, that's what that means. Oh, that's Dogen's, 3 questions. Oh, because like up to that point it had been, I'm just making noise, right? Memory is really interesting. Now this is my body. It's like, oh, that means something to me. So chanting, there's an interesting piece there about remembering teachings. When we sit zazen, right, we drop distraction. We remember how things really are. Oh, this is not about my fabrication. Oh, this is not about my distraction about that conversation I had with somebody at work, right? Oh, it's about this. Here, now, this body, mind, right? Let's remember, it's this. It's, the fabrication is not unreal, but it's this, right? There's memory, I think, going on there. Changing our habits of body, speech, and mind, which is quite a bit of what our practice feels like sometimes, right? Like we've got these really deeply ingrained habits of speech and thinking and what we're doing with the body. It means we need to keep remembering, oh yeah, I don't want to do that thing anymore. Oh yeah, my intention has been to let go of that and do this instead, right? Memory. So mindfulness is really an interesting part of this Eightfold Path if we look at it that way, right? I think there's some really concrete stuff there. Finally, concentration, right concentration, sometimes right meditation or right samadhi. So understanding of this particular element shifts across time and space from one Buddhist tradition to another. In early Buddhism, concentration was about sort of withdrawing from sense distractions, the craving and aversion that comes with 6 sense gates. And doing that was about achieving some kind of equanimity or mindfulness, right? That results in something ranging from a feeling of sort of basic contentment to some kind of rapturous peak experience. So folks did this by concentrating on something to the extent that it filled their entire awareness, and then your entire awareness takes in this object. So there is very much something about I'm focusing this to some degree to the exclusion of sense distraction. And we can see where now sometimes our understanding of mindfulness gets shifted around by some of those early practices. So if you're reading early texts, you run across phrases like, they want to stilling directed thought, for instance, right? Kind of taking all that and, right? So how is that different from what we do in Zazen? Well, the key is intentionality or lack of intentionality. Our Zazen has no goal. Our Zazen has no purpose. So in Zazen, we are not focusing on something in order to completely fill our awareness with it and drop off distraction from the 6 sense gates, right? There is no object, right? Zazen is Zazen is good for nothing, as we say, right? So when we sit, we create thoughts because we have past karma. In this human form, we've come from work, or we had an experience as children, or we have likes and dislikes, or I have pain in my knee because, right? And so there's things in this karmic body. We create thoughts because of all of that. If we're in relationship with the thoughts, I'm judging my thoughts, I'm embroidering those things, I'm writing a story, I am here, and my thought is there, and now we have thinking. Right? This is how thinking happens. If the thoughts are simply coming and going, but I'm not grabbing them, I'm not interacting with them, I'm not writing a story about them, there is no subject and object. There is no I that's doing thinking. There's no I having a thought. Are thoughts coming up? Yes. Are they going to come up as long as this body is alive? You bet. I mean, if there's no thinking happening here, we're dead. That's not what Zazen is. Thoughts are going to happen because we're in this karmic form. The question is, what are we doing with them? How are we engaging with them? How are we grabbing them and making them into something? Or are they simply coming and going? This simply coming and going with no subject object, no I and that's thinking a thought, is non-thinking, Hishiryo. We have lots of teachings in this tradition about thinking and non-thinking, thinking, not thinking, and non-thinking. This is non-thinking, Hishiryo. Thoughts are coming and going, we're not grabbing them. So this is not about concentration by like thinking hard about something. I like to think about concentration in this context as distilling. So sometimes we say something is concentrated. Orange juice concentrate, right? Laundry soap is concentrate. How do we distill down to the essence? How do we drop everything that's extra? How do we see that fabrications are fabrications? How do we see what's really going on? That is concentration, I think, in this context. Okay, so it's about letting go of extra, nothing extra, which is another common phrase for us here, right? Nothing extra. Okay, that is a whirlwind, no pun intended because it's a wheel, look at the Eightfold Path.